So here we have an excerpt from a sonata by Mozart for piano and violin that allows us to see how some of these NCTs can work in conjunction with each other and really, as in this example, kind of serve very similar purposes in terms of overall musical gesture. It also allows us to kind of see how the appoggiatura can be used as a non-chord tone, as we've talked about, but also kind of has that more generalized purpose in terms of actually being able to lean on a certain note in certain important areas. So what I have here is I have a harmonic analysis, whereas by this point in the movement we've actually transitioned to the parallel key of E major. So of course we start with a 1 chord, we go to a 2-6-5, we have a 5-2 chord resolving to a 1-6, and then it just kind of goes on all the way until this half cadence. So what we'll do is I'll kind of show you how I got to this analysis by how I treat some of the notes that I'm considering not really parts of the chords and therefore NCTs. So in the first example, you'll see that in the second chord, I've labeled a 2-6-5, but I've also kind of in brackets underneath said, well, maybe this is really a 4-7 that eventually transitions to a 2-6-5. And really the question comes down to what we do about the G sharp, kind of at the top of the stack and the outer voice of the right hand. If we consider it a chordal member, then yeah, this 4-7 actually holds true. And then what happens is, as we've talked about before, the 4-7's chords can really easily go into a 2 chord. So in this case, the 4-7 would turn into a 2-6-5 simply by virtue of the G sharp resolving down to an F sharp. But another way to look at this is actually to call it a 2-6-5 to begin with, and that G sharp is really just a non-chord tone. And if it is a non-chord tone, we see that the G sharp has been around for a while, right? So it's a pitch that has been prepared as part of a previous chord, and then it resolves down. And that kind of goes with, of course, the suspension. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the preparation way back at the beginning of this harmony here. And then, of course, its appearance as an NCT, at least as I've interpreted here in the 2-6-5, would happen here. And then, of course, the downer resolution is here. And I'll bracket that just to make sure it's clear. Okay, and so if I'm going to call it a suspension, then I've got, of course, label the type of suspension we have. And so I just measure the distance from A to the G sharp. Okay, and it turns out that that is a 7th. So this is actually a 7/6 suspension. So I'll just amend my label here to show that it starts off its life as a 7th and then resolves to a 6. Okay, so that's how I'm explaining that one, right? And so then as I continue on, before I continue on, I want to see that this actually has a slur marking here, if you can kind of see it behind my label. And as I look forward, I see a similar gesture in terms of articulation here, right? The C sharp to the B. And so I kind of look and I investigate and I say, well, that G sharp I had earlier, if I'm calling that a non-chord tone, I wonder if this thing here is a non-chord tone as well, right? And in my analysis, I've called it a 1/6 because what I'm really seeing is that this C sharp, even though I could use it as the root of a 6/7 chord, it probably, as I hear it, which we'll hear it in just a little bit, it doesn't seem to be functioning that way. It seems to be a visiting pitch in a harmony that really is a 1 chord, so a 1/6. And so if I take a look at how I got there, it turns out that I arrived at this new pitch by leap, and then it resolves by step. So in that sense, of course, this would now be an appoggiatura. So now I have 2 different non-chord tones, one a suspension, one appoggiatura, but they look like that they have a similar gesture, so I wonder if I might play them in a very similar way. So as I read through this, it does appear that in fact I can treat these arrivals of both of the suspension and as the appoggiatura as in a very similar way in terms of kind of treating those downbeats with just a little bit of tenderness or just a bit of lean, which kind of brings us to this more maybe traditional understanding of what an appoggiatura is in terms of a performance practice, right? It's a time when we get to really kind of dwell on a note for a little bit, and I think both the suspension and the NCT appoggiatura allow us the opportunity to do that. So now as I continue to look forward in my analysis here, I am looking for other ways in which this gesture might be applied. So as I go to the very next bar, I've interpreted that I'm continuing this one idea. Of course, I should note that I do have a couple of passing tones here, right? but I don't know that those are nearly as consequential as some of the others we have here, but they should be labeled, of course. And so now by the time I get to the next bar, I've arrived at this 4 chord, right? And what I have here is another passing tone in the D sharp, and it's a passing tone, I'm thinking, because in true pianistic writing, we kind of share staves. So this D sharp is really passing between the C sharp and the E, which in this edition is taken care of in the right hand. Actually, just so you know, other editions do have that E in the left hand. In any event, though, I do want to continue to kind of take a look at these pitches to see whether they're chordal or not. And it turns out, if I look here in the right hand, I have a very similar gesture to what I had just a couple of bars ago, where I hopped from somewhere below the staff and I hop up to the C sharp and then resolve down by step. So at first glance, it might look very similar to the appoggiatura I had just a couple of bars earlier, but take a look at this. I have a C sharp, right, within the context of a 4 chord in E major, which is actually a chordal tone, which in fact appeared earlier here in the top of the left hand. So even though the gesture looks similar, I actually don't treat it the same. It's not an NCT in this case. And even its resolution to a B, that's chordal because, well, now the chord has changed back to a 1/6. So that's one of the places I do want to be careful when I'm thinking about my non-chord tones. Not everything that looks like a non-chord tone is, so we just want to make sure that we're careful in our analyses here. Continuing forward to the next bar where we have the 5/6. Okay, so far everything on this downbeat appears to behave, right? And then I actually have a passing tone here, which is actually a passing 7th of the chord. And this would be kind of a judgment call for me. It isn't significant enough to warrant its own label or attribution as a 7th chord in the Roman numeral analysis. But I certainly do need to make sure I provide at least a recognition that it's a passing tone here. Okay, so a 5/6 resolving to a 1 chord, and then resolving to a 5 chord, although, take a look at what I've done here. I'm calling this a 5 chord when in many other cases I might have labeled this as a cadential 6/4. It seems to have all the ingredients, right? I have pitches that, when taken together, tend to spell out a 1 chord, which a cadential 6/4 does. And I've doubled the 5th, which appears in both the bass and in one of the upper voices. So it looks a lot like a cadential 6/4. Well, this gives us the opportunity to really understand something about the nature of the cadential 6/4, right? If I'm calling this a 5 chord, then what I need to do is I need to interpret these upper voices here in the right hand as pitches that really are non-chord tones. So if they are non-chord tones, well, what would I call them? It appears that in both cases, the G sharp and the E are both holdovers from my previous pitch, or rather from my previous chord. They're both holdovers from the 1 chord, and they continue over, and then they resolve down. So in this case, if I'm calling it a 5 chord, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to label both of these as suspensions. So suspension here, which was prepared back here, and resolves here, and then a suspension here, which resolves here, and is prepared back here. So these are suspensions. In fact, it's a cadential 6/4, which is created by suspension. And if you recall some of our conversations about the cadential 6/4, I spent a lot of time really emphasizing the fact that cadential 6/4s really arise as kind of decorative or embellished versions of 5 chords. And here we kind of see that just kind of happening, just in the repertoire. So we have a cadential 6/4 that comes as a result, in this case, of a suspension. Now, sometimes our cadential 6/4s come as other non-chord tones, maybe accent to passing tones or something like that. But I just want you to kind of get a sense of how the C6/4 could be interpreted in terms of NCTs. So what I'll do now is I will play this entire excerpt, and hopefully you can hear a little bit of how I color the performance to kind of emphasize the harmonic magic, I'll call it, that's afforded to us by these different non-chord tones. So we'll take a look at just the first couple of phrases from the final movement of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, which is just a harmonically, melodically, just artistically rich piece of music to begin with. And even in just the opening statements here, we have all kinds of material, including lots and lots of different non-chord tones. So we'll take a look at just a few. You'll see that I have added my Roman numeral labels here, and I just want to quickly mention this label here is something we haven't talked about. It's a German augmented sixth chord, which we'll learn more about in second year theory. But for now, just suffice it to say that it's a nice way to kind of transition our way into a cadential 6/4. So I want to turn our attention towards the second chord that I've analyzed here, this 5/7, which we see in parentheses. And the reason I have it in parentheses, you can see I've highlighted the bass line, this low C, right? That kind of hangs out for a while, right? And so it's hanging out for a while, even though in the middle of the first bar, I have these other pitches that suggest a 5/7 sonority, right? And so what I really have at work here is one of our NCTs of the week, a pedal point, right? So I'm going to go ahead and label this as a pedal, and I'm using the Roman numeral 1 because the pitch being sustained is in fact the root of the first of the 1 chord. So that pedal sustains certainly as far as the beginning of the second full bar, but really you could argue that sonority, that sense of the low C, sticks with us at least until this 5/6 that I have labeled. So we've got a pedal point there. The opening also gives us a couple of other NCTs. I'll first quickly acknowledge the passing tone we have in the melody here. Let me see if I can show that a little more clearly. Okay. And then also in the very next bar, looking melodically in the right hand here, we have a couple of examples of escape tones. We have the F natural, right, which is approached from the dotted quarter note before it by step, and then resolves by leap down to the D. And the reason I know that this F natural is an escape tone, well, it's got to be a non-chord tone of some kind because it doesn't belong to this one sonority. So it's a non-chord tone, and I see that it's approached by step and resolved by leap. So I'll go ahead and label that as an escape tone. And similarly with the E flat at the very end of the bar, that's also escape tone. That's also an escape tone because even though I've got the one pedal, the harmony that I'm really kind of focused on in terms of analysis is really a 5/7, right? So this E flat kind of escapes, so to speak, that 5/7 sonority. So I'll mark that as an escape tone is there as well. When you are doing your analyses of repertoire, it really pays to pay attention to certainly the big notes, I guess I'll put it that way, but also pay attention to the ornamental figures we're given here, right? In this case, we have an ornament right in the middle of the second full bar, right? This D is kind of an ornament, and here it's actually acting as an upper neighbor to the C's that surround it. Whereas if we look at the next ornament, we see that this ornament is actually approached by leap and then resolved by step, right? And it's accented, so it's right on the beat. And so this is a perfect example of an appoggiatura. And one thing I don't know that I mentioned yet in terms of appoggiaturas and escape tones, we refer to these collectively as incomplete neighbors. And here's kind of why. When you look at a neighbor tone, you'll see that the neighbor is surrounded by the chordal pitch that it's embellishing, right? Whereas in the case of an incomplete neighbor, the chordal pitch is only on one side of that note. So we see that here with the escape tone, and we see that here with the appoggiatura, right? So they neighbor chordal pitches, but only on one side of that chordal pitch. So the escape tone will serve as a neighbor after the chordal pitch and only after the chordal pitch, whereas the appoggiatura serves as a neighbor just before the chordal pitch. So because they don't have the chordal pitch on either side, we will also call those incomplete neighbors. So already, just in the first couple of measures, I have, pedal point, I have passing tone, I have escape tones, I have neighbors, I have appoggiaturas, right? And so he kind of keeps going. And so what I would like you to do is I would like you to actually see how many other non-chord tones, whether from last week or from this week, you can find between here and the perfect authentic cadence I have labeled.